Okay, so let's talk about Caleb Cain's big performance and his business model and what he's doing. And I want to try to explore a little bit about why he's doing this, along with why legions of others, individuals like Anita Snarkeesian and the innumerable other members of what I'm calling the great moral outrage Ponzi scheme of the late 2010s. Why people have come to choose to participate in this thing. And so first of all, what Caleb Cain is a liar. What he's doing is, his story is a fabrication. His hero's journey story is a falsification. It's a fabrication. It's it's not even a very, and it's acted with acting that isn't even very good. What's actually happening here with this particular individual, and first of all, I'm not a mean person, and I don't like to say mean things about people. But typically, with the people who, there are two choices that you can make when there's a change in the power structure of a large human civilization, right? And that's another topic, but to choose to go in the direction that Caleb Cain and these others have gone in is something that I typically when I see this, I typically categorize these people as cowardly opportunists, or cowardly wretched opportunists, or just opportunists, depending on the conditions under which they are engaging in opportunism. At any rate, there's a lot more to this story than just a person of particularly low character or inferior character. There's a lot going on here. There's actually a 30-year evolution of a dysfunctional, perverted economy that has resulted in these kinds of choices, these activities amongst those looking for ways to participate and contribute value to the market. So, that said, I don't just want to be doing name-calling to talk about what Caleb Cain has chosen to do, and others like him. I want to explore a little bit about the process of why people end up going in this direction. Just before moving on, I want to make mention that I'm actually quite surprised that Mr. Reagan was misled, or somehow believed Caleb Cain to not be perpetrating something disingenuous, Mr. Reagan describing Caleb Cain as I think he referred to him as something like a lost soul, as if he believes his story to be coming from some place of honesty, which is, I was surprised. I'm surprised at you, Mr. Reagan. I thought that you would see through this obvious performance. At any rate, so a little bit more about what's actually going on with Caleb Cain, what he's actually perpetrating. What he's chosen to do, and this became clear at a certain point in his CNN interview when he disclosed that he's got a nonprofit or something and a team that's so-called, this hat's loose, and I've had to color my hair, and it's in the first 48 hours, and those of you who have reached this age of 40s or whatever and have to color your hair know that in the first 48 hours it looks absolutely ridiculous. It just looks comically stupid, and I'm not so unaware from a fashion standpoint that I don't realize this. It's just that, you know, when you aren't part of the champagne limousine socialist club, you can't afford those $400 salon coloring jobs. At any rate, what's actually taking place here, which is somewhat clear to me, is that Caleb Cain's enterprise is part of a coordinated, planned collaboration between him and this leftist machine, this moral outrage Ponzi scheme that is an entire economy of its own. And it has nothing to do with a genuine hero's journey that he has put forth. And I don't claim to be an absolute expert on every facet of Caleb Cain's life experience and such, but I did watch a good 9 or 10 minutes of this young man talking, and that was enough for me to see that it's a non-genuine expression of events that have not taken place entirely as he describes them. It's a performance, and that it would have been one thing were he to have described, you know, in some kind of candid way, the kind of journey or process, emotional and intellectual process that he went through. But when he followed it up with, and now my team endeavors to, however he put it, endeavors to de-radicalize. When he used the word team, I was just like, ah! Yeah, this guy's got a racket going, and he's really doing something that isn't much different from what many of us have done. So let's look at what's going on, you know, with why people like him and so many others, including myself, have chosen to engage in these opportunistic activities that only really in the end destroy market value, while in the short term bringing some, you know, accruing some wealth or resources to ourselves, which is a choice that I did make at a certain point. I chose to engage in the virtue signaling, informant activities, essentially is what it is. It's informing activities, in the same way that all of these others have, and I am greatly ashamed of it, and I just thank God that the little enterprise that I got started didn't take off. So let's talk about what that is. What has gone on here? We have had something like a 30-year economic decline in the West. I mean, what would you expect to happen if you take an entire country's productive foundation and strip it out and outsource it to everywhere else in the world, and then claim that you're something like, oh, we're a service economy, so it's fine. Give me a break. You know, what would you expect? What happens is, you know, it was said to me by someone, I can't recall who, it was quite a wise thing to say. At the beginning of, it wasn't the beginning of the economic decline, but it was around the '08 GFC when somebody said to me, it was at that point that the economic decline was no longer deniable, and it was actually reaching a point where people were really finally starting to talk about how bad our economy had become and was becoming and was looking to become going forward. Someone said to me, an economy cannot persist based on one guy selling things out of his garage to another guy on Craigslist. You know, in other words, without a base of production to have a legitimate economy by which you generate earnings, create wealth, generate earnings and create wealth, you know, essentially all you have in the end is is one guy selling things to another guy that he's, that have already been produced, and etc. So, where do you go from there? Somebody said, this person that said this to me said, we're in real trouble because an economy can't persist on this kind of an activity without actual creation of value taking place. And of course, so, the kind of trouble that we were looking at, however, who could have imagined that 11 years later, the kind of trouble that we'd be looking at would have resulted in these mutations of market participation, these perversions of individuals seeking for ways to contribute value to the market and going out into the world and trying to create something. Who could have imagined that it would have turned into such an incestuous, wasteful layer of abstraction upon the economy wherein no real value is being created? And what do I mean by that? That's a lot of maybe superfluous language. What I'm talking about is, in any economy, when economies are doing well, companies look outward. They look for opportunities to capitalize on the growing economy, or the functional economy, the healthy economy, and they're looking to generate more sales. They're looking to build, just generate more orders, generate new business. When economies are slowing down or contracting, companies look inwards. They look to cut costs, essentially. They look to downsize, cut departments. They look, they do whatever it takes. What we're looking at, essentially, is something like, it's getting dark out here. It's something like an advanced stage of this phenomenon, where in our the market participants in our economy have not just begun to look inward. We've spent something like 15 years looking inward to try and find ways to survive. And it's just, you get some really weird things. Some really, like I said, perversions of productive market activity, perversions of productive market participation. Things that are just dysfunctional, long-term, unsustainable, and just damage long-term value. And that's what's happening. Why are all of these young-ish people, rather than looking to innovate or create or discover or produce, they're looking to do something else? And there's a lot of ways to look at what's gone on here, a lot of angles, and I've tried to figure out a way to tie them all together so as to say that they're all part of this, cohesive theory with that just has various levels of abstraction. But in fact, I think it's just different angles that this can be looked at. So, what's the other angle? The other angle to look at this thing is that what is going on here is that, oftentimes it can be useful to say there are two kinds of things, there are two kinds of people in this world, or there are two kinds of ways that people... It's not always true, there's a spectrum, but for the purpose of simplifying the argument, it's useful to say that it may be useful to say that there are two ways to contribute value to the market. There is the creation side of activities, and there's the criticism, the evaluation, the assessment, the judgment side. And both are legitimate and extremely useful. They're both equally useful. Without creation, you have nothing to... That really does... It's often maybe considered... Critics are often considered to be useless and lacking in, talent, or even... not ambition, but character, because they are not the ones that are creating value and contributing. That's not true. Without the criticism side, the assessment side of the equation, you get where I'm going with this. You just get creation with no refinement and no continuous improvement, like in Japan with their principle of Kaizen, continuous improvement, which has resulted in the kind of thing you see with Japan, which is like, it's essentially 50 years, in many ways, if you've ever spent time in Japan, it's essentially it's like living in the future. I mean, it's just a model of in many ways. In some ways, they've got huge problems, but in many ways, it's just a model of human behavior, city planning, and civil discourse, all of those kinds of things. Society, that's the word I'm looking for. So anyway, there are perhaps we could say two ways to contribute value to the market: to create and also to critique. And what we've seen here, it can be said, I believe it's valid to say that what we've seen here is a massive mutation and perversion of the criticism side of the equation, because there's been no opportunities to create anything. The Obama years, the Obama years were really awful, but even well prior to that, we have had, I mean, it's really been acute for the last 15 years, where every opportunity and every event of capital investment and creative endeavor has taken place right here where I am. And what do you think is going to happen when every product is produced and every construction project is built somewhere other than in the United States? How can you expect, so it's been a really nasty 15 or 20 years, you could say 30, but eventually what happens is people go from looking unsuccessfully for opportunities to contribute and moving on to finding, just like when I talked about how when economies are shrinking, companies look inwards. They look for opportunities to cut costs, because you can generate earnings for your individual departments, or even just individual managers can generate earnings for themselves. One way is to generate new business, but it's just as effective oftentimes to cut costs by cutting departments or cutting business or refining business processes. So you move from, when the economy's shrinking, you start to look inwards to cut costs and that sort of thing. And if you've exercised every opportunity to reduce costs, times it is, I'm gonna have to do these videos a little earlier. It's 7:15. I hope this one comes out okay. It's really, these cameras don't do well in low light. At any rate, once you've exhausted all opportunities to cut your costs, to reduce your cost structure, what do you do then? That's when the stuff that V talks about. Now, if you haven't checked, I'm sure anyone who's happened upon this channel knows about V. And V talks about, quite often, what happens when things get really bad. And they have in the West. They've been, really? They've been really bad for a long time. What V talks about essentially is when you get this kind of situation where things are like they are here and like they have become in the West, what's essentially going on is that somebody wants a bigger apartment. And the way that you get a bigger apartment, V has told this story about what his family has experienced in the past. What you get when someone wants a bigger apartment is that they'll inform on the authoritarian regime to let them know that their neighbors have been talking, that they can hear their neighbors through the wall, and they're talking, and their neighbors get disappeared, and the informant gets the bigger apartment. That's essentially what we're talking about here. That's what's going on. And it's, to say that it's, to describe the, the pejoratives that are needed to describe this kind of activity, I don't know. Hey, people can be small. Everyone can be small, including me. I did have something very nice fall into my lap that I then worked very hard on to create, to build into something very successful in a very non-lucrative field, which resulted in me not being wealthy, but still, my company is very successful. We actually are #1 in our market segment, But it wasn't financial, it wasn't a very lucrative enterprise because it's mental health in Southeast Michigan. So, you know, it's just, I made this organization very successful in its market segment, but I was still quite hungry. I still have been. I've always been still quite hungry. I'm not done. And in 2015, after experiencing an entire adult life in the workforce, my entire professional life experience has been one of no opportunities, nothing really happening. The only people I even saw really doing anything, well, that's another matter. The fact is, the opportunities have been during my adult life have been in other places where we outsourced all of our work, to which we outsourced all of our work. And in 2015, I went about creating what is essentially tantamount to Candace Owens' social autopsy. I did. I created LOL Hate Speech, which is League of Legends hate speech, a website that allowed users, players in the game, to upload instances of hate speech used by other players to report on them. I spent $1,000 on a developer and worked on this thing for 6 months and built it out with an absolutely perfect UX, user experience. You know, it allowed the user to upload a screenshot, and then within the web page there was a tool where you could crop the screenshot to capture just the chat in the lower left, showing the hate speech that was used, and then there was categories into which you could upload the item. There was racism, misogyny, the R word, and there was a fourth category I can't recall. But then in like blog style or search style, the site would then list all of the examples of hate speech, indicating the player name who perpetrated the hate speech, and it would list them all in chronological order. You could search by category, or you could just list all of the items in category view, and you could search by racial slur and all of the examples of, like, the N-word. No, was the N-word a separate category? No, that was just part of racism. At any rate, if you searched for retard, for example, you would get a list of all the screenshots and the player, the IGNs, the in-game names of those who had used the retard and the actual screenshot of them doing so. I really put a lot into this thing, and it didn't take off, thank God. By the time I was finished building the thing and it was time to market it, it was just like, I've spent enough time on this, and actually I don't know exactly why I just gave it up. I like to think it's because I knew it was wrong. Before I gave it up, I did spend one afternoon getting onto like a couple of Facebook groups that are part of this moral outrage Ponzi scheme, Me Too movement thing. And posted, hey, look at the site I built. Absolutely abysmal choice of how to spend my time and how to position myself in the economic universe. I'm really ashamed of this. But at any rate, there's more to say. I like to think, because I've been through it, that there's more to say about people who choose to do this than just to say that they are cowardly opportunists. Because we have gone through something in the West that it's just been really awful. You know, perhaps we are to blame, we ourselves are to blame, or perhaps Yuri Bezmenov's description of what has been perpetrated upon the West is more to blame, whatever it is. I would give some advice to Caleb Cain. I would say, young man, what you're doing, you know, the left really likes to talk about, you know, being on the wrong side of history. You know, we all know that everything the left says is a projection of their bad behavior and intellectual dishonesties. I would say This is something I can tell you from personal experience, you're just not going to want to have as part of who you are and what you've done in the world. You really want to try to find some other way, even if it isn't as lucrative, to bring value into the marketplace and to contribute and participate, because this isn't it. So I think that's it. I look forward to another video where I talk about, I think I want to talk about how Anita Snarkeesian is looking at a 15-year decline in the market's appetite for what she's offering up. And how, again, I don't like to be, screw it. She deserves everything that's coming to her. And this is another reason why I say to Mr. Caleb Cain, you don't want to go down this route. Anyway, I hope this was helpful.